This material is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This material was originally recorded in March of 1971. There is no introduction to this material. The recording begins in mid-introduction for Mr. E.K. Gaylord, who is the speaker for the Newcomen Society. That's Newcomen, and we presume this society is meeting in Oklahoma City upon this date. This material is being re-recorded on November the 12th, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
A great many of the good things we see about us in Oklahoma, and especially in this community, had their birth in the mind of this man. While shaping the destiny of Oklahoma, he has built a far-flung business empire. It is with pleasure that I present to you one of the most courageous, vigorous, and forthright men I have ever known. The wise and intellectually visionary leader of his community, a living legend who inspires us all, Mr. Edward King Gaylord.
I'm not a governor. Thank you. As a very kind introduction from a very good friend, I wish I deserved all he said about me. But I think you all know that the city and state owes a tremendous debt to Dean McGee. His company that he's built up here is a bulwark to the economy of Oklahoma City and of the state. Personally, he's done so much for education and medical center and everything. So used to going on. I want the privilege of introducing a few men with whom I'm associated in other ways, who are out of the state and have been kind enough to come here. As indicated by Mr. McGee, I've been a director and one of the founders of the Southland Paper Mills about 32 years ago, and we have the honor of some of the officers and directors being here this evening. I'll ask Mr. R.W. Wortham, Jr., Chairman of the Board and President of Southland Paper Mills of Lufkin and Houston, Texas, to stand, please. And the Vice President, a man who is the chief engineer as well as vice president, chief engineer of both mills, Melvin Kurth Jr. And a personal friend who is a director and a fellow publisher because he is chairman of the board of the Carter Publications that publishes the Star Telegram in Fort Worth, Mr. B.N. Honey, director. And Mr. J. William Price, a director of Southwest Paper Mills and vice president of the Perkins Goodwin Company with headquarters in Dallas. Mr. S.W. Henderson, the director of the Southland Paper Mills of Lufkin and he's interested in many other business. Mr. Henderson. We have with us the managers of some of our out-of-town industries, and I'd like to introduce Mr. Eugene Dodson, who is Vice President of our television stations and the manager of our television stations in Tampa and St. Petersburg. He's recently President of the Chamber of Commerce in Tampa also. And also from Fort Worth and Dallas, we have studios in both cities, Mr. Jim Terrell, manager of the station. And from Houston, the manager of a television station in Houston, Mr. Crawford Rice. And from Milwaukee, we have the manager of our station there, Mr. Joe Laughlin. And then we have a man from Dallas who is circulation director of the Farmer Stockman, our farm magazine, Mr. James G. Bray. Thank you. It's a signal honor for the Oklahoma Publishing Company to have its story placed in the archives of the Nuclear Society of North America. It was a great surprise to us that our company should be selected to appear along with a so distinguished a corporation, so many distinguished corporations. Perhaps its beginning with almost nothing is in a very crude frontier town, and its growth through 68 years under one management is somewhat unique. The growth of Oklahoma City and the growth and development of the Oklahoma Publishing Company are so completely intertwined that the recital may seem more like a skeleton history of Oklahoma City than of our company. The story began in December of 1902 when I was business manager of St. Joseph's Gazette, Missouri. As Christmas approached, I decided to go to St. Louis for a few days' rest. In reading the newspaper, I found an item in the St. Louis Republic, which was a brief interview with Mayor Carter Harrison of Chicago. He said he had been in Texas and coming back through Oklahoma territory on the train, he saw fields of cotton on both sides of the road, white for harvest. He said Oklahoma territory could raise the crops both of the south and the north, and being between Texas and Kansas, someday it should develop into a state with comparable cities and towns. He further remarked that if he were a young man, he would go there to start his career. His statement electrified me with an ambition to locate there and launch or secure a newspaper of my own. I knew nothing of the towns in Oklahoma, their size, or what newspapers are there. I looked up an NWA or newspaper directory, found that there were just two towns of any size, Oklahoma territory, Guthrie and Oklahoma City. Strangely, the population of Guthrie was, in 1900, was 10,006. And the population of Oklahoma City was 10,036. This mystery will be explained later. That night I went to the theater and sat next to a traveling man who I found had covered Oklahoma on numerous trips. He told me that Oklahoma City, far bigger and better than Guthrie, it had more railroads, but the main reason was that it had a live bunch of young men in business who were wide awake and progressive. The next day, I made arrangements to leave for Oklahoma City. Right here, I must digress to explain Oklahoma territory was not by any means what is now the state of Oklahoma. state of Oklahoma comprises nearly 70,000 square miles. The first opening of a settlement in Oklahoma in April 1899 was a small patch comprising only 2,950 square miles, covering only about 5 counties. There were 5 additional subsequent openings of Indian lands to settlers, and ultimately Oklahoma Territory could be described roughly as the western half of the original Indian Territory. Arriving in Oklahoma City, I checked into a little hotel on Main Street, where the John A. Brown department store is now located. I set out to see the business district. Stores and retail businesses were confined mostly to the 2 blocks on Main Street and partly on Grand Avenue between Broadway and Harvard. Most buildings were either 1- or 2-story brick, and traffic on the streets was chiefly lumber wagons, with now and then a horse and buggy, because of course this is prior to the advent of automobiles. All streets were dirt roads except for 1 block of paving on Main Street, 1 on Grand, and 2 on Broadway between Grand and First Street. There was a livery stable on the corner, First and Robinson, where the First National Bank now stands. At the northwest corner of Grand and Robinson, Grand, of course, now has changed its name, where the Concord office building is located. There were cottonwood trees and a small pond, and where water was standing. And west of that location was a lumber yard, opposite the present Oklahoma Hotel. On this corner where we were sitting, Arm & Company had a wholesale meat store, and halves of beef and pork were hung up on racks. And there was a loading dock at the rear connecting with Rock Island, whose trains, both freight and passenger, ground their way through the center of the city on what is now Cutts Drive. The Frisco Railroad also came into the center of the town, circling into the south, and its passenger and freight terminals were located where the Civic Center and City Hall now stand. My first objective was to look in all the retail stores' windows to see the kind of merchandise for sale, because you can size up the kind of people by the class of merchandise they purchase. Most of the stores showed an average good type of merchandise for a frontier town, and I was surprised to find a music store offering several Kimball pianos and 1 Steinway. This convinced me that there were people of refinement and education among the early settlers. I walked in each direction as far as there were any houses. West on Main Street to the 900 block. East across the Santa Fe to the 1100 block. North to 13th Street. From 13th Street north to 16th, between Chartel and Robinson, it was all a flourishing wheat field. It was marked out in blocks and streets, but there were no houses, except the Overholser Mansion was beginning construction. Klassen had laid out this area for the Bonton residential section, which now is known as Heritage Hills. Beyond 16th Street were farms. South over the North Canadian River, there were perhaps 20 to 30 small frame houses, very small. The hastily built town was crude and uninspiring, but its possibilities as a metropolis of a future state intrigued the imagination. There was one morning paper, the Daily Oklahoman, and an evening paper, the Times Journal. Before going to either of them, I went into a bank and interviewed the cashier. I told him I wanted to investigate the newspapers, and perhaps buy an interest in one if I could. I asked him which would be the better paper. He said, "It won't make a damn bit of difference which one you buy." Neither one of them is worth a hoop in hell. I went to the Times Journal first, but they were not interested in selling an interest or employing a business manager. I went to the Daily Oklahoman, which is wholly owned by Roy Stafford. The paper was published in a store building at 18 at South Broadway in a room 25 feet wide by 60 feet long. It was the dirtiest plant I ever saw. Cobwebs hung down from the ceiling. Dirt was on the floor. There were 2 or 3 desks on either side as you entered, and both a job shop and a newspaper machinery occupied the back. The Oklahoman was printed on a flatbed press, limited to 8 pages, and producing about 800 copies an hour. There were just 2 linotypes. The floor was covered with cuttings of paper from the job press, and there were less than 20 employees. It was the most magnificent opportunity I had ever seen because there was so much room for improvement. Mr. Stafford was very agreeable, admitted he was in debt, and seemed much interested in selling an interest and getting a business manager's experience on larger papers. We exchanged business references and agreed we'd meet again in about 2 weeks. Returning on January 17th with the help of attorneys, we made a contract to incorporate the Oklahoma Publishing Company, which would purchase the Daily Oklahoman. Stafford would not sell the control, but sold a substantial minority to me and to 2 young men I brought with me from St. Joseph, Ray Dickinson, an advertising man, and Roy McClintock, a news editor. After cleaning the plant as thoroughly as possible, we sold the job printing plant to get it out of the way, and I rented an office myself in an adjoining building. The Oklahoman had no wire service, but received a pony service or news dispatches at intervals over the Western Union. We arranged for the full night wire service with a telegraph operator, and as soon as possible made a contract for a new building at the northeast corner of California and Robinson, with an area 6 times larger. We bought more linotypes and ordered a 16-page perfecting press with a color deck and moved into the new plant in October. A few weeks after my arrival, the city entertained a cattlemen's convention, and to head the parade, they obtained a company of cavalry soldiers from Fort Sill. Some drunken bystanders shot and killed a soldier, a murder that would disgrace the city. I stayed at the plant that night to see that every angle of the murder story was in print. Next morning, to my consternation, there was not a word in the paper about the murder. I was very provoked and went to the office to see why it had not run, and was told Mr. Stafford had killed it because the president of the Chamber of Commerce had asked him to, saying it would hurt the town to publish such a story. I said the story will be in Guthrie, Kansas City, and Dallas papers, and everybody in town will wonder why you suppressed it. We're going to get out an extra. And an extra had never been heard of in Oklahoma before. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there was another murder in the alley adjoining our building that morning. By noon, we got out an extra with the story of 2 murders instead of 1. Shortly after we moved into our new quarters in California and Robinson, I came to the office early as usual and decided to rush out to meet me and warned me that the assistant chief of police was there with a gun in his hand, threatening to kill somebody. We had had a story that morning that the assistant chief of police was the payoff man and collected money from all the gamblers. I went back to the reporter's room, and there was the assistant chief of police in uniform 6 feet 3 or 4, and as I entered, he turned to me and demanded, "Did you read that article about me?" I said, "I'm not a reporter. I didn't write it, but I am manager of this paper and I'm responsible for it." "But you are wearing the uniform of a peace officer and coming in here threatening to kill somebody. You're no peace officer. Go and take off that uniform before you come around here with a gun in your hands." He wilted. He fumbled trying to get his gun back in the holster, and he slunk out of the room. We never heard of him anymore. During all this period of rapid city growth, there was talk of statehoods for Oklahoma, combined with the Indian Territory. And in Indian Territory particularly was a good deal of clamor to have separate states. The Oklahomans strongly advocated single statehood. The territories had begun to attract attention. The railroads even ran special excursions once a month to bring in prospective settlers to this city and others. The population boomed. Citizens claimed that there were 3 men to 1 woman in the population, and that there was only one retailer on Main Street who was more than 30 years old. That was only a slight exaggeration, and the predominance of men in the population is correct, for many single men had come to start a career in a new frontier. An extraordinarily good fortune came to the Oklahoman in February of 1904. The Oklahoman had no Monday edition. Neither did the morning papers in Guthrie or Wichita, Kansas. News dispatches Saturday were very ominous in that a war might break out between Russia and Japan. I was very concerned that war might start on Sunday, and we would have no paper until Tuesday morning. We asked the Associated Press if we could have a Sunday and Sunday night wire and what it would cost. They replied that all we had to do was to pay the telegraph operator. We got a skeleton crew in the composing room, another in the stair-trap room, and one in the press room, and some newsmen, and commenced receiving dispatches. Soon there was a story that Japan had attacked the Russian fleet. The telegraph editor made out a 7-column head of the war and sent it to the composing room. Dispatches began coming in from Baltimore that there was a great fire on the docks. To make a long story short, in a matter of hours, we had far more copy on the $200 million fire in Baltimore than we had on the war. We wound up with a 4-column head on the Baltimore fire and a 3-column head on the Russo-Jap war. We had telephoned to Wichita and Guthrie and found that their newspaper plants were dark, and we decided to print as many copies as possible and sent boys with 2,500 copies to Wichita and 1,500 to Guthrie. We doubled or trebled the regular orders of all our news dealers throughout the state without asking permission. Papers were sold out everywhere. The Oklahoman had made a sensational scoop, which brought us new subscribers from all over the state. In 1906, Scripps Howard established the Oklahoma News, an evening paper in Oklahoma City. About the same time, 2 brothers started a free afternoon paper called The Pointer, supposed to be delivered free to every house. Its competition injured the Times Journal and the News without too much effect on the Oklahoman. The Oklahoman's chief competitor seemed to be the Guthrie morning paper, named the Oklahoma State Capitol, which swore to a circulation of 21,000. The Oklahoma at that time had about 7,000 or 8,000. We heard that the Guthrie paper was printing not more than 6,000 copies, and an investigation showed that that must be true. The post office part in Washington, we obtained the weight of all second-class mail sent through the Guthrie post office for a year. There were 14 publications, mostly weekly or monthly, in Guthrie, and the figures show that if all the second-class mail was for the state capital, it couldn't have over 6,000 or 7,000 circulation. I wrote a long letter to Printers Inc., which was the Bible of advertising agencies, advertisers, giving all the figures showing that the Guthrie paper was fraudulent in claiming 21,000 circulation. Printers Inc. published a letter covering 3 or 4 pages. As libelous as could be, if it wasn't true. It made a sensation in the newspaper world, and shortly after, a man named Wells appeared in my office from the Darcy Advertising Agency, St. Louis. He'd been appointed to come down there. He asked if he could see our books and watch our press run. I told him he was welcome to see anything, to talk with any carriers, any employees, and he could give him all the information, free access to check everything, and he verified our circulation after several days. He went to Guthrie, but was refused an opportunity to check their circulation. However, Wells stayed around there, and through press room windows, timed their press run, counted the number of mail sacks, talked with their carrier boys, and was convinced they had no more than 6,000 circulation. He reported this to the advertising agencies, Printers Inc., and advertisers, and soon many advertisers were demanding refunds from the Guthrie State Capitol. In a year or so, the Guthrie paper folded up. Our exposure of fraudulent circulation claims of the Guthrie newspaper was one of the factors which a few years later led to the organization of the Audit Bureau of Circulations. Our company was a charter member, and I was elected a director. The Audit Bureau now is universally recognized, and no publication dares to refuse to be audited. Early in this story, I mentioned the mystery of Guthrie in Oklahoma City having almost identically 10,000 population in the 1900 census. The explanation was this. The Secretary of the Interior was a czar that controlled the territories, and he had issued an edict that no city in Oklahoma could post bonds to build a city hall or a jail until it had 10,000 population. In 1900, both Guthrie and Oklahoma City lacked considerable of having 10,000 population. Enterprising citizens, however, copied names off the hotel registers, names on the tombstones in the graveyards, invented the ages and the occupations and other necessary statistics, and the census enumerators accepted them. They were added to the population. This enabled each city to vote and build a city hall. While Congress was considering a bill to give statehood to Oklahoma, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered a special census for both territories in April 1970. Oklahoma City found to have a population of 32,405, and Guthrie still 10,000. 2 years and 8 months later, the 1910 census, our city had a population of 64,205, nearly doubled in 2 years and 8 months. In October 1907, President Teddy Roosevelt closed all the banks in Oklahoma and the nation. The Citizens Committee for the Chamber of Commerce issued scrip to be used in lieu of money. Believing that the banks would eventually open, we advertised annual subscriptions of $2.95, and we would accept checks on any bank in Oklahoma. We got thousands of checks from all over the state. I piled them up and counted them about 100 in a bundle to take the bank when the bank's open. We got thousands of checks from all over the state, And many people thought they would never get their money out of the bank, but they would at least have a year's subscription to send in a check. Gradually, restrictions were removed, the banks operated normally. The agitation for statehood finally brought results, and Congress passed the Enabling Act in June of 1907 with a provision that the two territories be merged into the state of Oklahoma and state government organized to begin operation November 16, 1907. The act also provided the state capital should remain in Guthrie until 1913, although the location was far less accessible than Oklahoma City. The state constitution provided for initiated petition, and I asked Judge Ledbetter to prepare a petition for voters to vote their choice between Guthrie, Oklahoma City, and Shawnee for the capital. Our circulation solicitors obtained signatures to petition from towns all over the state. The election was called. A tremendous campaign was put on the City Chamber of Commerce and other organizations. Oklahoma City led Guthrie by more than 50,000 votes, and Shawnee had only a small vote. A suit by Guthrie resulted in the state Supreme Court invalidating the election on the ground that the question as phrased by the attorney did not use the exact language of the statute. This meant a second petition and a second election between Guthrie and Oklahoma City, and again Oklahoma City triumphed by more than 50,000 votes. In the meantime, Governor Haskell, on the first election, had moved the state offices to Oklahoma City, and the Supreme Court of the United States later upheld the right of a sovereign state to locate its institutions wherever the voters chose. In October 1908, a man named Thomas E. Wilson, who was the executive vice president of a packing firm named Morrison Company, came to see Sidney Brock, who was president of the Chamber of Commerce, and he was also the first owner of what is now John A. Brown Company. He wanted to see Sidney Brock, and he said he wanted to build a packing plant in Oklahoma City, but wanted all arrangements made with just a few leaders and without any publicity. A committee consisting of Sidney Brock, Antone Slasson, John Sartell, and myself was appointed to work up a contract with Mr. Wilson. A committee consisting of Sidney Brock, Antone Slasson, John Sartell, and myself was appointed to work up a contract with Mr. Wilson. About 1 o'clock in the morning, after we'd been here several days, we signed a contract guaranteeing to raise $300,000 from Morrison Company to build a $3 million packing plant southwest of the city. Nothing was published, and farms were bought and options on land around the site were obtained because they planned to sell lots for business districts and residential districts. The announcement was a sensation, and $300,000 was pledged in 2 hours at a public meeting. I don't know if they do that now. About 1 year later, Schwarzschild and Sulzberger, another packing company, offered to build a plant adjoining Morris plant and demanded a $300,000 bonus. The city agreed. The money was pledged in a few weeks. A short time later, Thomas E. Wilson, who had left Morrison Company and organized his own packing company, bought out Schwarzschild and Sulzberger, and later on, Morrison Company sold out to Armour Company. In 1906, the Oklahoman had bought lots at the corner of 4th and Broadway. In January 1909, we started clearing the lots and excavating at 4th and Broadway after making a contract with a St. Louis firm to build a building. We were printing the Oklahoman at the northeast corner, California and Robinson, when suddenly about 11 o'clock in the morning, and this is about 2 weeks after we'd started the building, there was a loud explosion of gas in the basement, and fire started immediately. We got everybody out of the building. The fire department was pouring water into the building from 3 sides. The fire burned the floor of the composing room,
and our 5 linotypes crashed into the basement. While the fire was still burning, I made arrangements to print 8 pages to the Oklahoman on a Times Journal plant, and it was several weeks before we could replace linotypes and other machinery that was destroyed. Our building at 4th Broadway is practically complete October 1st, and we moved in, occupying about half the space. Hard times were coming on, and we rented half of the front office to a tire company and office space to other firms. The city very much needed a new post office, and the bankers and leading citizens in the Chamber of Commerce unanimously agreed it should be located on the west side of Harvey between Grand and Main Street. This area was flat and frequently flooded because there was insufficient storm sewers. We sent a photograph of the area when it was under about 6 inches of water to the postal authorities in Washington. No one knew this. When the official came to select the location, he was given a unanimous recommendation of the Harvey location. To their astonishment, he rejected it and on his own motion selected the corner on the hill at 3rd and Robinson. Chamber officials and citizens were dumbfounded that it should be located 3 blocks from Main Street, and they never knew why. We had nothing to do with the selection of 3rd and Robinson, where the entire block is now covered with federal courts, the post office, and across the street to the Federal Reserve Bank. In 1910, the Free Pointer had taken a lot of advertising away from all the newspapers, and it had no news service other than a local reporter or two, and carried about 90% advertising. It was entering all the papers, and we decided to launch a free paper called the Free Press. We made it a real newspaper, carrying as much or more news than the Times or the Oklahoma News, and Descriptive free. This made a flood of newspapers in the city, and eventually the Pointer sold out to the Times. I think it was 10, 11 months. And we suspended the Free Press, although by that time it was profitable. The Times and the News were both losing money, and in 1915 the Times suspended publication, and the Oklahoma Publishing Company bid it in at share sale for $30,000, but we received only its circulation list and the name. Its other property was sold and liquidated in indebtedness. The Times had about 10,000 circulation, but now it has more than 100,000. We have been publishing a weekly Oklahoman, but in 1911 we converted this to a farm magazine, which is now called the Farmer Stockman, published monthly, and it covers 3 states, Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. Oklahoma City and the new state of Oklahoma is riding high on its rapid growth when it was struck by the worst drought in its history. In 1911, the rainfall in 1911 was a little more than half of normal. Crops dried up, cattle were starving, thousands of farmers abandoned their farms, and many trekked to Arkansas or Tennessee in covered wagons. Their farms were left to the insurance companies who held the mortgages. Many businesses closed. Advertising circulation was drastically reduced. There were 7,000 vacant homes in Oklahoma City. We had to cut wages and salary of every person, reduced employment as much as possible. There was a slow recovery during 1912 and 13, and a general pickup when the World War I broke out in 1914. In 1914, Governor Williams appointed a commission to build the state capitol, of which I was a member. The legislature had passed a law authorizing the building, but restricted it to 3 stories. The legislators were mostly farmers. The architects planned a 3-story building, but put in it a basement, a sub-basement, and a mezzanine, thus providing 6 floors in a 3-story building. Otherwise, the Capitol building would have had to use twice as much ground. During the war years, we were restricted to use of newsprint and other materials, lost many employees to armed services. During the summer of 1918, Roy Stafford sold his stock to the company. I was elected publisher, editor, and general manager, a position I've held since. The period from 1920 to 1929 was one of steady growth for our papers in the city and the state. For more than 20 years, the city had tried to get the Rock Island and the Frisco railroads to take their tracks out of the business district. Finally, a committee of three from the chamber tentatively agreed with the railroads that the freight trains should be routed around the city, but the passenger trains would remain. Trains frequently blocked traffic on Broadway, Robinson, and other streets. I was greatly disturbed, and it occurred to me that both railroads were bankrupt in the hands of a receiver, and that the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company owned most of their bonds. Mr. Ecker, the president, was a friend of Frank Buckham, and they owned a few oil wells together as partners. I asked Mr. Buckham to see Mr. Ecker to see if he wouldn't order both companies to remove their tracks. He immediately took the matter up, and Mr. Ecker said, of course, Oklahoma City ought to have the tracks removed. And he ordered the officials of the roads to make the best deal they could, but remove the tracks. In 1929, the city voted $4 million and purchased about 20 acres, including land for the Civic Center and Couch Drive. A fabulous Christmas present came to the city on December 4th, 1928, with the discovery of the oil field within the city limits. The financial panic covered the country in 1929, but our oil field boom helped carry us through the Depression years. Early in 1930, the railroads cut off many passenger trains, delaying or destroying armies delivering newspapers throughout the state. There had been a morning and afternoon train to Lawton, and as a substitute, one train left the city about 10 o'clock in the morning, too late for the Oklahoman, too early for the afternoon times. Our circulation department was forced to buy or lease trucks, but the business was too great to be handled by the circulation department. And we incorporated Mistletoe Express. Mistletoe not only took care of the delivery of our papers, but it handled merchandise of every description, from retailers, manufacturers, wholesalers, and for years it has covered not only Oklahoma, but expanded into 4 other states. Now has terminals in 50 or more important cities. Its service is a great asset to many businesses in the Southwest. In 1932, President Franklin Roosevelt elected and immediately closed all the banks nationwide. Again, the Chamber of Commerce issued scrip, which was used in lieu of money until the banks reopened. Oklahoma was afflicted with another drought in the years from 1932 to 36, and business was depressed nationwide until 1937. In the early 1930s, the Associated Press was developing a wire photo, transmit photographs by telegraph. Experiments have been going on for a long time, and one day in 1934, I was in Dallas and was paged in the hotel. The manager of the Associated Press in New York told me that they could give service to the Oklahoman and only 14 cities be on the line to start with. We could get on the Continental Wire going through Kansas City to the West Coast. I asked the cost. Roughly it was $39,000 plus the cost of the operator and the cost of zinc and other supplies. I said, well, roughly that'll be $50,000. We'll take it. The Oklahoma thus was a chartered member in only 14 cities in the United States for the use of transmitted photographs by wire. Some months after this, I met the publisher of Tulsa World and he asked me how in the world we could afford to spend $50,000 for wire photos. I said that was not the question. The question was, how could we afford to do without them? It was several years before Tulsa got the service. The Oklahoma News, without previous notice, suspended publication in February 1939. It had operated for 36 years and lost money for 33 years. This left the Oklahoman and Times as the only daily papers published in Oklahoma City until 1964, when the Oklahoma Journal began publication as a morning daily, which is still in the field. After Pearl Harbor, the government was frantically trying to build military installations, including a material depot in the Southwest. Stanley Draper, the managing editor of the Oklahoman, had anticipated this and had contacts with the big brass of the Air Force in Washington. The Air Force officers two Air Force officers were sent here with a list of 5 locations, Oklahoma City being number 1. They refused to meet with the committee of the chamber, asked for one man to consult with them for a week. At the end of the week, at 9 o'clock in the morning, they brought in a list of demands which had to be fulfilled by 4 o'clock on the same day. Their demands included a gift of 390 acres, options on a lot of additional land, an 8-lane concrete road 6 miles east of Capitol Hill, 40 miles of state highway graded and graveled, a 24-inch water main from Oklahoma City, the water supply is about 10 miles, the removal of all pipelines and obstructions from the site, a railway line building to serve the plant, and numerous other requirements. They assumed it would be impossible for Oklahoma City to fulfill their demands. They bought tickets to Wichita, where they had friends and hoped to locate the air depot. Stanley Draper, who has done more to expand and upbuild Oklahoma City than any other person, took charge with the aid of Mayor Hefner and a few others, and a written guarantee covering each requirement was handed to the officers at 4 o'clock. They were dumbfounded, and Tinker Field was located in Oklahoma City. This was a tremendous boost to the employment of the population of Oklahoma City, the creation of Midwest City and other suburbs, and the biggest lift to Oklahoma City's economy which had ever occurred. It was accompanied by a government arrangement with Douglas Aircraft to build a manufacturing plant which produced 5,700 DC-3 planes during the war. Tinker started with an estimated payroll of about 40 million, and in recent years, with nearly 30,000 employees, the payroll is nearer to 250 million. It is impossible to list the scores of other industries which have come to Oklahoma City, including the FAA Center, but in the census of 1960, there was a population of 535,000 within 30 miles of the state capitol building. That was the circle. In 1970, we'd grown to at least 625,000. We had dispatched today that the 3 counties comprise the Oklahoma City greater area had nearly 641,000 population. So that's another interesting problem. The Oklahoma Publishing Company's growth accelerated right along with that of Oklahoma City. It not only quadrupled the size of the printing plant, but established a chain of broadcasting properties, which began with the acquisition of WKY Radio in 1928. We built studios and a transmitter and went on the air November 11th, 1928. It bound to lose money because few people had receiving sets. The radios cost us as high as $500. It was nearly 2 years before it became profitable. It was the first commercial radio in the state. In 1948, many states had no television stations. The Federal Communication was practically begging people to take out a license to begin broadcasting televised programming. Publishing Company decided the state ought to have a television station and applied for a license. We expected the usual red tape would take several months, but the license came back almost by return mail. We then had to build the studios and a transmitter before anyone had a television set. When the programs went on the air, people began buying receivers, but too few in number to pay the expense of operation. WKY was the first television broadcasting station in the state, and it had to operate a considerably long time before it paid expenses. A few years later, WKY was one of the first in the country to produce programs in color. In February 1955, we purchased and operated a station in Montgomery, Alabama, which was sold in 1959. In 1956, we purchased a television station in Tampa, St. Petersburg, which we continued to operate. 1962, we got a contract for a station in Fort Worth, covering the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And in 1964, we bought a station in Milwaukee. In 1966, we bought a station in Houston, Texas, all of which we're now operating. The recent decades of 1960s, 50s, and 60s were periods of very rapid and substantial growth for Oklahoma City, the state, and likewise for Oklahoma Publishing Company. This record is well known to you. The story will have to be deplorably incomplete because it should contain the names and activities and accomplishments of hundreds of prominent citizens who fashioned and molded Oklahoma City and Oklahoma as it is today. Likewise, it is my great personal regret that I cannot list here the names and the invaluable services of hundreds of men and women who created what is the Oklahoma Publishing Company and its thriving subsidiaries. If I were to mention even a few of the able and devoted staff members whose work helped establish the reputation and career of the company, I was doing a great injustice to hundreds of others, not included, who were just as eager and helpful in building this company's foundation. For that reason, I'm mentioning only my son, Edward L. Gaylord, who for 15 years has been Executive Vice President and who one day will take over my position. At some other time and in some other way, I hope to pay due credit to literally thousands of employees who have built up this company in the past 68 years. In its entire history, Old Pubco has fought under the banner of honesty in government, progress in education and culture, high standards of morality, generosity in philanthropy, betterment of social conditions, and the constant improvement of economic conditions. I apologize for the length of the talk, and I thank you all very much for coming.
Mr. Gaylord, you have given us a tremendous thrill this evening. It's so interesting to have history come alive. And perforce many Newcomen presentations are told by chief executives or presidents of institutions who obviously have not lived the history themselves, have lived certainly a most important part of it. But this evening's experience for me and for, I know, everyone here has been a thrilling one. You've brought the history of Oklahoma and of the territory before it, the history of this great city, and the history of your enterprises forward in a most forceful and dramatic and entertaining and human way. And this is a rare thing. I can't tell you how privileged we are, Mr. Gaylord and Newcomen, not only have had you here this evening, but to look forward with the greatest pleasure to distributing this very important American story of private enterprise. I do think that and I don't think I would offend anybody here this evening if I truly were to refer to you as Mr. Oklahoma. Indeed, last year, almost at this time, when Dean McGee addressed us so brilliantly on the story of Kerr-McGee Corporation, and indeed Kerr-McGee is a total energy corporation, a total energy company. Yours, sir, would appear to be a total communications enterprise. You have your newspaper publishing, your trucking venture, most successful one, your radio station, and your television stations. And I must say I'm mightily impressed, as all of us are, in looking at the members of your staff. A most alert and fine-looking group. I'd like to share with you, if I may, a letter, an unsolicited testimonial, which meant a lot to me because, you know, when you're sometimes so deep in the forest you don't see the trees. And so it is in attempting to serve the Newcomen Society's membership under our Board of Trustees. But I had a letter from a Newcomen member named Joe Greeley from Chicago, who just happens to be the marketing vice president of Leo Burnett Company, which of course you recognize as being one of our good advertising firms in this country. And he writes under date of February 10 to me, Dear Mr. Penrose, the Newcomen Society in North America is doing a fine thing in supporting the free enterprise system the way it does. I would like to have every man, woman, or child in this country read the publications so that they can acquire some sense as to the great achievements of business over a period of many years. Kindest regards, sincerely, Joe Greeley.